there, and welcome once again to The Verdict. Mick Cornett with Kent Meyers. We're here every week, meeting interesting people and dealing with topical issues, and we welcome in an old friend.
Oh, old friend and an old roommate of mine, in a sense. Well, Robert
really?
Yes, Robert was at Crow Dunleavy with me, and we officed for a while right next door to each other. And he could always hear what I was saying on the phone, and the reverse was true as well. So he has a nice resonant voice that you'll hear in a few minutes. But yeah, Robert responded to my request that he come on and talk about a subject that confounds me and a lot of other folks, and that is sentencing, both from a state standpoint and a federal standpoint. What does it mean when somebody gets 60 years? What does it mean in the federal system? What does it mean in the state system?
Certainly an evolving topic.
Indeed.
We'll get to it right when we get back. Robert McCampbell, today's guest on The Verdict.
Right now, 6 feet can feel like a long ways away. But from 6 feet, we can still smile at each other. From our doorways and our stairways, from opposite sides of the street and opposite sides of the country. Through fear and frustrations, we can remind each other that we are still here for each other. Because we can still smile at each other. And we're not going anywhere.
Military service ran in my blood, starting from my father, which joined the Navy, on the Chickasaw side, my uncle, which served in the United States Army. I'm Benjamin Espinosa, Chief Petty Officer, United States Navy, and I'm Chickasaw. I went to the Secretary of Defense's staff at the Pentagon in Washington, D.C., which ultimately led to becoming a combat support technician for Naval Special Warfare, specifically SEAL Team 10. I think to be proud and to love your tribe, to love being Chickasaw, you also have to love being American. You also have to love everything that America stands for. Equality, perseverance, professionalism, and power. I want my family to know that their father is a good person, but also feels that he has an obligation to the country and to love this nation. Anything worth having is worth dying for. The military and the country owes me nothing. I owe it everything.
See more stories about the Chickasaw people at profilesofanation.com.
Welcome back to the set of The Verdict. Mick Cornett with Kent Meyers, and Kent's going to introduce today's guest.
Well, as we talked about in the open, our guest today is a longtime friend of mine, former law partner of mine, and a guy that I've just dealt with for 40 years, Robert McCampbell. He is now with the law firm of Gable and Gottwalls. When he was with our firm, while we officed right next door to each other and had a lot of laughs and a lot of fun. Robert did his undergraduate work at Vanderbilt University, did his law work at Yale. He's been in practice now in the Oklahoma City area for in excess of 30 years. For a 4-year term, he was the United States Attorney for the Western District of Oklahoma, appointed by George W. Bush, and just did a marvelous job in that federal position, and then came back to practice law again with us. He is a fellow in the American College of Trial Lawyers. He has a lot of other activities, but that's the one I want to highlight. He has a very significant trial experience, both in the civil area and in the criminal area. He is, I'm just going to embarrass him now, but he's obviously very bright. He's highly respected. He is a zealous advocate for his client, but he does so in a respectful, civilized way that allows good communication. That's what I really think a lawyer ought to be, and Robert is the epitome of that. Robert, we're sure glad to have you.
Well, I appreciate you having me, and Mick, I'll tell you, when I officed next to Kent, What I remember is I always wanted to try to get to the office earlier than he would, and I never could do it. And Kent, you know, he's driven, he's full of energy, and I know Kent's had a ton of success in the practice of law over the years.
I've gotten my own 4 o'clock emails from Kent, so I know exactly what you mean.
There you go.
This is an evolving topic we're going to discuss today because it involves sentencing, and in general terms, the viewer of this show is going to say, well, a person's been convicted of a crime and then they are sentenced. But there's so much discussion these days about what a sentence should be, who should determine it. How did you get brought into this topic, and what are your overall general thoughts on where we are today?
Well, it's important to recognize we have 2 systems of justice in the United States. We've got a federal system and we've got a state system. Most of my work was in the federal system, both as a federal prosecutor and then as U.S. Attorney. John Ashcroft asked me to be chairman of the Sentencing Committee for the Department of Justice. So for 2 years, in addition to being U.S. Attorney, I spent a huge amount of time on sentencing policy, which I was glad to do because it's really interesting and really important. And you're exactly right. There's a lot of differences. A sentence can mean a lot of different things depending upon which system you're in.
We always hear about the federal system, the sentencing has teeth. What do they mean by that?
Well, starting in 1989, there was a system called the Federal Sentencing Guidelines to have certainty of sentencing and uniformity of sentencing across the United States. So there was a famous study in New York City back in the early 70s. It was about draft dodgers and what kind of sentences they got. And what they found was there were 6 judges who would always give a draft dodger time to do, 6 other judges who would never give a draft dodger time to do. And so it's not really justice, it's a lottery on what judge you draw. So the sentencing guidelines were designed for more uniformity. So every federal crime, you've got a system of factors that tell you how serious it is. You also count criminal history, and you come out with a range. So for example, a bank robber, suppose he's a bank robber, robs a bank, brandishes a firearm, doesn't shoot anybody with it, and takes more than $20,000. Well, his offense level would be 26. Suppose our bank robber has 1 prior felony conviction. It's within the last 15 years. He's in criminal history category 2, so his sentence would be 70 to 87 months. Pretty predictable, pretty uniform across the United States.
Well, your role in the guidelines, you had a significant role in trying to get them prepared and adopted, did you not?
Yeah, the big issue that happened, I got appointed to sentencing committee, which I thought was really interesting. What we didn't know was that the sentencing guidelines were getting ready to be declared unconstitutional. So I ended up in the eye of a hurricane, but it was really interesting. And what we worked through was the United States Supreme Court said mandatory sentencing guidelines were unconstitutional. So we changed them so that they're advisory. And so they still get calculated. The judge still has to consult them. They're not mandatory. I was testifying about it at the Sentencing Commission in Washington, and I said, well, you've got a system where the guidelines are unconstitutional, but you still have to use them. And I said, it reminded me of the old country western song, how can I miss you if you won't go away? But it's the system we've had, and the truth is, it's served us well for the last 20 years.
You got our studio laughing now. I don't know where we can go. What about the sentencing guidelines, the numbers that are attributed to certain things insofar as severity of offense and the like? They have to be consulted, but a judge can deviate below or above the guidelines, I take it.
Sure. So there's a bunch of factors out there. Some are pretty easy. Did the bank robber, did he brandish a firearm or not? If it's a drug crime, you weigh the cocaine and you know how much cocaine was at issue. Some of them are complicated. One of the enhancements is if the crime substantially endangered the safety and soundness of a federal bank. Well, you could have an entire lawsuit just on that topic, but it's one of the factors.
So answer to that is rob a state bank, not a federal bank.
Well, it's federally insured banks, so it's virtually every bank
okay.
in the United States. But that's how the federal system works, and so it can be quite complex. There's 6 different criminal history categories. Sentencing hearings can take days working through the factors, but there's a lot of predictability. There is no parole in the federal system. You can get 54 days per year good time credit. Other than that, it's a day for a day. So person gets a 10-year sentence, they're going to serve 8 years and 4 months actually inside. Pretty darn definite.
There's a part of this debate is the ongoing discussion about what should happen to a person when they're incarcerated. Are we putting them there to punish them? Are we putting them there to try and rehabilitate them? Does that play into the sentencing guidelines at all?
It does. You're exactly right. So sentencing, rehabilitation, punishment, and deterrence are really the 3 main goals. And the sentencing guidelines try to work through all of that, also layering on this idea of fairness, that it's going to be pretty much the same. But you want to have sentences which are meaningful enough to be deterrent, that they are definite enough, which the studies show also makes a difference in deterrent.
Well, can a sentence also get into what type of incarceration it is? You know, not 100 years ago, but nearly that far, you would hear a person was sentenced to hard labor. And now somewhere along the line, I assume they stopped putting that as part of the sentencing, but was those types of addendums or definitions part of the sentencing guidelines?
They're not part of the sentencing guidelines. Under the federal system, that's all left to the Bureau of Prisons. And so you really have, how they classified a defendant. Is it a high-risk defendant or a low-risk defendant, which affects where they are incarcerated, or can they get out on some sort of halfway house situation? But that's pretty much all there is.
What about multiple offenses? How does that get into the sentencing? I mean, if a person is a habitual criminal and they come back into the federal system multiple times?
There's a couple of things that can happen. If you get sentenced at once, there is multiple count grouping, and if we had an hour, I could explain that to you. But then there's also criminal history categories, and the categories are weighted so that the more priors you have and the faster they are with respect to each other, your criminal history category gets really high really quickly. And the point there is, it's unfortunate, but there's certain people in our society who are determined recidivists, and if we can identify those people and incarcerate them during their crime committing years, we are all safer. And it's relatively few, but we need to be protected from those people.
Men and women, are they treated the same in the sentencing guidelines?
Yes.
And regardless of age, is the 18-year-old, is that the magic date for when a crime is committed as to how a person will be treated as a juvenile or an adult?
Everybody over 18 is treated exactly the same.
All right. Robert McCampbell's our guest. We're talking about sentencing and a lot of other things with Robert McCampbell and his incredibly rich life experiences in the legal system and also in the federal justice system. We'll be right back.
The Vet Hero office at the University of Central Oklahoma, it is a one-stop shop for veterans when they're trying to get their education.
I call it my encore job. I get to take care of veterans. We help them transition. I was that guy that transitioned after 24 years, and in the end, GI Bill is a benefit that those soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marine earned. It was the thing that made us the greatest country in the world coming out of World War II, and it will continue to do the same thing for this future generation of service members.
OU Law has a history and heritage that are unparalleled. At the University of Oklahoma College of Law, we empower our students to pursue the career of their dreams. We have the highest U.S. News ranking ever achieved by an Oklahoma law school. We are the first law school in the country to launch a college-wide digital initiative. And this year, our competition teams rank number 2 in the nation. OU Law, generations of excellence limitless possibilities.
Welcome back to the Set of the Verdict. Our guest is Robert McCampbell. Ken?
Robert, you hear in various places that someone has been charged with a crime and has pled guilty. Another person may be charged with an identical or virtually identical crime and has gone to trial and been found guilty. The person who pled apparently will get a lighter sentence than the person who goes to trial if everything else is equal.
All things being equal, typically the person who pleads guilty would get a lighter sentence. Under the guidelines, if you accept responsibility, that actually subtracts 2 points from your offense score, and defendants who admit their guilt typically get a 2-point reduction. Defendants who go to trial typically testify and typically are found to have testified untruthfully by the jury. They typically get an enhancement of 2 points for obstruction of justice. The 4-point swing usually worth about 25% of the sentence.
Wow.
Let's switch over to state courts. It seems like there's 50 different systems, and all of them have some sort of conversation going on these days about changing them. I mean, nobody seems to be pleased with their own state's court system and the sentencing. So where do you come down on all of this?
It's incredibly complicated, and there's a huge number of defendants to deal with. The current system, state system in Oklahoma, does involve some variations. So sentences are typically negotiated with the prosecutor as part of the plea agreement, or they're set by the jury at trial. And so there can be a material variation from county to county, for example. You also have in Oklahoma State Court a parole system, which is again unpredictable and changes from defendant to defendant. And so there can be significant uncertainty about what the sentence is and what it means.
What determines if a judge determines a sentence or if the jury determines the sentence?
Well, in federal court, the judge determines it. State court, the jury determines it. If there's a plea agreement, which there usually is, the state court judge will virtually always accept the plea agreement, and the plea agreement will be worked out with the prosecutor what the sentence will be.
But I presume the state court judge can reject the plea agreement entered into between the defendant and the prosecutor, just saying this is too much or too little, or I don't like it, and force them then to go back and try again or go to trial.
Exactly, and that can happen, and your choices are work out a new plea agreement or have a trial.
For a while, we went through what was called 3 strikes and you're out. We can look back upon those days. How did that turn out?
Well, it does measurably increase the number of people in prison, which, on the one hand, to the extent we've identified determined recidivists, that's a good thing. We're protecting ourselves from those people. On the other hand, really expensive. It's about $20,000 per prisoner per year, and there's not a way to account for it, but you addressed age. The studies are all really clear that as someone gets older, particularly violent crimes, their odds of committing another violent crime decrease dramatically. Somebody over 40 years of age, it's almost impossible to get them to commit a violent crime.
Really? That's a dividing line?
And
it's 40?
Well, it goes down over the years,
yeah.
But I'm saying, if you get somebody incarcerated for life for something they do in their 20s, that same person in their mid-40s, dramatically less dangerous.
Well, talk about a parole system and what in Oklahoma, what is it designed to do and how is it working?
So the parole system, sentences in Oklahoma, they can be either very predictable or not predictable at all. So the most serious crimes are under what we call the 85% rule. Things like murder and armed robbery, you have to serve 85% of the sentence. And by the time you've done that, you've accumulated enough good time credits to get out. So 85% is pretty much the minimum and the maximum. But most prisoners, more than 80%, go into the ordinary parole system where they're eligible after 30%. 30% of their sentence. But that doesn't mean they're getting it at 30%. The Pardon and Parole Board has discretion, victims have the ability to object, and there can be material variation on who gets parole and who doesn't.
And the Pardon and Parole Board only recommends parole, does it not?
Correct. It's ultimately the governor's power as part of his executive powers, but there's a 5-person board, 3 from the governor, 1 from the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, 1 from the Chief Judge of the Court of Criminal Appeals. They each get an appointee.
Talk a little bit, if you will, about pardon, and then I want to ask you, when you get through with pardon, to talk about commutation.
Sure. So pardon is the ability of an executive, either the president or the governor, to pardon the person, which means they're not guilty of the crime anymore. And it's happened, there have been some high-profile cases in Washington. There's a lot more, both in Washington and Oklahoma, less high-profile cases where someone, for example, made a mistake when they were young, they've paid their debt to society, they've been a contributor to society, and 25 years later, a governor might pardon them and say, okay, you're no longer deemed convicted.
And what about commutation?
So commutation is the power of the governor to change the sentence. And so you see from time to time where a governor will say, okay, you've served enough of your sentence, I'm going to commute the rest of your sentence. Or we've had some times when the prisons were so overcrowded, a governor would say that everybody who's within 90 days of the end of their sentence, we're going to commute the end of the sentence.
Is there any federal equivalent to commutation?
Sure. A president has the power to commute sentences.
And pardon, of course.
And pardon.
We hear a lot about pardon, but not much about commutation.
The pardons get a lot more attention, no question.
There's data that suggests, especially at the local government level, that poor people are incarcerated at a much higher rate than is necessary. Your thoughts on that? Any data through the years that support changes need to be made?
Well, yeah. So certainly if you think of like county jails, there is no question. And part of it is, they're unprepared. Part of it is they can't make bail. Sometimes people get incarcerated because they've got unsatisfied fines. And those are all hard situations. You got to have some consequence for people that don't pay their fines. But let's face it, that's disproportionately going to be people who can't afford their fine, and not obvious that we're better off with those people in jail.
It's well known in Oklahoma that we incarcerate women at a very high rate. We incarcerate people at a very high rate. Are we doing better, or is it just not getting any better through the last few years?
Well, define better, but no, Oklahoma.
Are we getting more toward a national average than being the outlier?
No. So we're typically first or second in the United States, us and Louisiana, on having the highest sentencing rates. Right now, the most recent figures I saw, we incarcerate people about 1,000, little over 1,000 people per 100,000. The national average would be about 700 per 100,000 of population, so about 30% above the national average.
Robert, we have just about a minute left. Give us your thoughts about what's going on in the legislature about sentencing reform or sentence changing.
Sure. So there's a major initiative that's proposed in the legislature this year that would change Oklahoma to a sentencing matrix, similar to the federal guidelines, similar to what most states have, where there'd be 14 categories of what the offense is. You take into account criminal history, and sentencing would be much more uniform. So that will be a major change. It will be a major reform, and be really interesting to see what happens in this legislative session.
Any prediction?
It's hard to predict. Sweeping criminal reform traditionally is very difficult to get through a legislature. On the other hand, most states do it, and it's been successful most places.
Our guest has been Robert McCampbell. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you, Robert.
Thank you.
Kent and I'll have a final word when we return.
It used to be okay in hospitals, It used to be okay in movie theaters. It was okay in classrooms, restaurants, and airplanes. But thanks to a greater understanding of the dangers, that's not okay anymore. So now that we know secondhand smoke causes lifelong health problems, why is it still okay to smoke with children in the car? Bottom line, it's not okay. Let's get serious about protecting kids. Join the fight at stopswithme.com.
All children deserve a life of hope and love, but sometimes they experience a life of pain, neglect, and abuse.
When that happens, each child deserves all the quality assistance and representation that can be offered in our legal system. For more information, call 23-CHILD.
Oklahoma Lawyers for Children, helping to bring hope and love back to the lives of abused children.
You will always be mom and dad to me.
You have children coming from a different lifestyle, different mindset. You have to open your arms and really do what you have to do to have that child become a part of your family. And if it's more patience, that's what you do. Kids gotta know they can trust you. And that's what we've tried to do with these kids.
You will always be mom and dad to me.
The Journal-Record is pleased to be a sponsor of The Verdict. The Journal-Record, since 1903, the best source of Oklahoma business news and legal information.
Welcome back to the set of The Verdict, wrapping up the show with Robert McCampbell.
Yeah, Robert just does a grand job in the practice of law and is a fine human being and a really good guy.
Yeah, he can explain some very complicated things in a very concise manner.
Yeah, he's had to explain some complicated things to me a number of times.
He's a good guest. More information about Robert at his firm, gablelaw.com. That's gablelaw.com. And we have a website. You can log on and tell us about a guest you'd like to see or a subject you'd like to see us addressed. And that website is theverdict.tv. For Kent Meyers, I'm Mick Cornett. We'll see you next week on The Verdict.